I've posted a bunch of videos about how there are definitely two serial killers in The Devil in Me, one of whom is Hector Monday, and the other is the serial killer previously known as the Imaginary Killer, and who I colloquially refer to as the Dollmaker, because he's the one obsessed with repurposing corpses for his dioramas. While there's already proof positive that these two are separate people, Mark is hiding from the Dollmaker at the exact same moment that Jamie is watching Hector Monday relive his interrogation with Manny Sherman. Someone is operating the security cameras while Dollmaker is driving the limousine. All of these require some degree of inference and assumption. That's no longer an issue, though, as I've found a concrete piece of evidence which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that there are two Grantham Dumets running around the murder hotel during the course of the game. What proof is that? To explain, it's time for a quick lesson in handwriting identification. I'll let Philip Baker Hall from the movie Zodiac explain.
We choose at some point in our lives how to physically construct each letter. Once we lock that into our brains, our handwriting may change over the years, but the moves themselves remain unaltered.
So, while there might be differences in handwriting based on speed at which something is written or the emotional state of the writer, there's going to be key similarities that hold fast every time they write a letter down. Now let's take a look at some of Dumet's handwriting, which is incredibly consistent across the entire game. Every time you see his handwriting, it's clearly made by the same person. Check out these notable flourishes, the strange way he writes his lowercase t without lifting his pen, effectively creating an inverted number 4. Look at the way he swoops the stem of his lowercase d off to the right, his tiny e's that barely have a loop, the dashed off r's that almost look like v's, his weird dipping f's, the double story a, the g's with sharp straight lines coming down and to the left, the x's that are drawn with a loop on the right so he can do the whole letter without lifting his pen. Honestly, the developers did an incredible job of designing handwriting for Dumet that is incredibly recognizable. Once you've seen his writing, you can identify it immediately. He consistently writes lowercase letters exactly the same. Take special note of his philosophy for writing the letter K. There's two basic ways to write the letter K, with a vertical line, then a diagonal line coming off up, and then a third line coming down diagonally from the vertical line around the place the second line started. Now sometimes this is drawn with two strokes, i.e. a vertical line, then draw an angled or curved line touching the vertical, and sometimes it's drawn with three, a vertical line and two diagonals. In either case, the format of the letter, in that the lines come off of the vertical, remains consistent. The other way to draw a K is a vertical line, a diagonal line going up, and then a second diagonal line coming down, originating not from the vertical line, but from the diagonal up line. This is a completely different way of constructing the letter K, and you won't see a person using both of them. Dumet's system, and this is consistent whether he's writing on a notepad or chalkboard, is that he writes the letter K with both the diagonals coming off of the vertical line, generally making the whole letter with two strokes. This consistency extends to his uppercase letters, with one exception I'll just get out of the way immediately. Sometimes he writes capital I's with serifs, and sometimes he doesn't. They are consistently as long as all the letters around them, though. He has a quirk with his uppercase letters that is immediately as identifiable as those in his lowercase letters. Dumet, as a rule, does not connect the lines of his letters to a frankly weird extent. He draws mostly straight, harsh lines that don't cross one another at all. Sometimes the lines will touch, but they will never cross. Let's examine how he makes the various letters we see in the game. Here's the name Ned Yoke. Note that the N is written with two clearly separate strokes, one vertical and then a separate one that comes down and goes back up. Now look at the Y. Straight vertical with a fork at the top. That N is consistent across all appearances of the letter. As for the capital Y, like the K, there are two prominent ways to write this letter. The first is what Dumet has chosen, a straight line with a fork off the top. The other is a diagonal line going up and to the right with a smaller line branching off of it up and to the left near the top. Like the K, people will consistently draw the letter Y one way, almost never both. Look at this T, which he draws by making an upwards diagonal slash and then following it with a vertical line that's nowhere near connecting to it. His W's and M's are significant because he writes them with a single stroke, rounded points, and the middle peak or dip doesn't go as far as the end ones do. His H's are consistent in that the horizontal line never touches the left vertical. Sometimes it touches the right, and sometimes it doesn't, but it never touches the left. Here's a capital K where he drew the curved diagonals pretty damn far away from the vertical line. His capital L's are super weird, in that most of the time, he doesn't bother drawing the horizontal line. The one time he does, on Laura Murphy's card, it's separated. He usually writes his capital L's as if they were capital I's, without the serifs. His R's and B's are consistent in that he draws the vertical lines first, then the loops and lines on the right. On the B's, they're mostly connected, but don't cross, and the R's are generally disconnected. His S's are very identifiable as well, with a soft top loop that starts already in the curve, and then a complete curve and tail at the bottom. His D's and P's also consistently connect the swoops to the verticals, but they don't cross. His O's are full circles with no breaks in them. I kind of love the G in Grantham Dumet here, where he's basically drawn a C and then put a super hard right angle on it. Which brings us to the weirdest capital letter Dumet draws. This is his J, which is a nearly straight vertical line with only a hint of angle at the bottom and a tiny serif at the top. We see this letter 4 times across the game, and it's always exactly this bizarre. So, now you've got a pretty good idea of what Dumet's handwriting looks like, the lowercase and especially the uppercase. You can probably identify them at a glance at this point, right? So let me ask you something. Who is tracking the team on this whiteboard? Because it sure as hell isn't the Dumet whose handwriting we've been reading this whole time. For clarity's sake, we'll call the writer of the letters we've seen up until now 1, and the whiteboard writer 2. Let's start at the top, where we can see both of them have B's with larger bottom loops. But 2's have wider loops and a long serif at the bottom. We see 1's capital E just twice in the game. Once where he wrote down the word ferryman under Mark's name, and once on the blackboard. And in what might be considered almost a parody of his own writing style, he writes it with 4 completely disconnected lines. Writer 2 has 2 big crosses that are completely inconsistent with 1's handwriting. We never see 1's capital A, but 2's has an extravagant cross that 1 just wouldn't use. 2's D has a long tail and a wide loop, completely different from 1's. 1's R has barely connected loops, but 2's starts to the left of the vertical, doubles back through it, and then has a distinctive drop at the end of its tail. It looks nothing like 1's R to the point where they could be completely different letters. Remember 1's S with the late top loop and the full bottom loop? 2 doesn't draw the bottom loop at all, making his S look almost like a flipped question mark. In a super strange quirk, not only does 2 not draw perfectly round O's, he doesn't even draw all of the letter. He writes 75% of the O, essentially making a C with a slightly higher end. As for the C's, while 1 is sometimes sloppy with his, they're generally the left bracket looking things you'd expect, while 2 writes C's as a slightly curved line coming in almost straight down and then getting flat at the bottom. Where 1 drew a capital Y with a straight line and a fork at the top, 2 uses the 2-stroke diagonal with branching diagonal method. 2's N is drawn in a single stroke, starting super high from the first vertical, and then having a rounded turn at the bottom of the diagonal. Check out 2's G. It has a long dip going down from the end of the curve. It doesn't seem to go into the letter at all. It's completely different than 1's take on the letter. When 1 bothered to put a horizontal line on his L's at all, it was a separate stroke. But 2's L is drawn with a single stroke and a rounded corner. Not only is 2's I never drawn with serifs, it's consistently shorter than the letters around it, unlike 1's capital I. The T is almost aggressively different, where 1 always separated the 2 strokes. 2 never misses poking the vertical up through the horizontal line at the top. Remember how 1's H never touched the left vertical and only sometimes touched the right? 2's horizontal line always crosses the left vertical. That brings us to the K, which has such clear rules about construction. 1 consistently uses the method with lines coming off of the vertical, often with 2 strokes, sometimes not connected at all, while 2 offers a very distinctive take on the other method, where the down diagonal comes off of the up diagonal. This is clear when he's drawing the big capital at the start of the word kitchen, as well as the small capital at the end of Mark's name. And what about 1's most distinctive letter, his weirdest, most idiosyncratic take on the capital? As you can see from Jamie's name, 2 draws the letter J completely differently, with no serif and a full curve at the bottom. As you can see, there's not one single letter drawn on this whiteboard that is in any way consistent with the Dumet handwriting we see over the rest of the game. In a sense, it's kind of an amazing piece of work by the developers. because they spent a huge amount of work designing Dumet's handwriting, keeping it consistent across a dozen different documents, then built an entirely different set of handwriting to use basically just once, all for a payoff here that almost no one would ever notice. Hell, I've played this game I don't know how many times, and I only just now saw it. I know this might sound like a stretch, but take a moment to consider the realities of video game production. Someone had to build the dumet font, both upper and lowercase, then remain perfectly consistent in using it over the whole game. Then they had to build another font for the whiteboard, clearly operating under the mandate that every single letter used had to have a distinctive difference from the dumet font. If they were just dashing off some capital letters, you'd end up with a couple that looked kind of the same. The vast majority of people using Roman letters draw their C's the same, and every Roman letter user on Earth draws their capital O's effectively identically. But this font designer had to make them different in every case, leaving them with no choice but to give us the absolute madness that is this attempt at an O. It's really an incredible piece of work. All of the hints and circumstantial evidence pointed to there being two people portraying Dumet. But this handwriting evidence can't be explained any other way. This is proof positive that there are two men working together to create the Dumet persona, Hector Monday and the doll maker. Can we guess which one wrote the notes versus the whiteboard? Sadly, no. There's no real evidence pointing us in that direction. We do have a single word that we know for a fact was written by Hector Monday as a child, an all-caps mother, but it's a child writing with a crayon, so we can't really look to it for a definitive answer. The M and the O looked like they could be from one's handwriting, with the rounded points and complete O, but all the letters are connected and even have crosses, so it's not really useful. Oh, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but you can find the super distinctive font of Writer 2 somewhere else in the game. Specifically, the name tag on Natalie Morella's dead body in the freezer. It's not easy to make out, but if you look closely, you can see all of the telltale signs of his writing, from the joined and crossed letters to the absolutely bonkers O. Even their numbers are different. The 7s are distinctive. Both use a cross, but Writer A doesn't connect the top of the vertical, and Writer B's cross is much wider. And the 1s are notable as well, with Writer 1 using straight lines, and Writer 2 putting a serif at the top. I think it's worth noting that Writer 2 only ever puts their handwriting in ephemeral places, either a whiteboard that will be erased when the game is over, or a name tag that will be destroyed when the body is dealt with. If I had to guess, I'd say based on how far Hector has gone to eliminate all traces of his existence, it's more likely Dollmaker would be the one doing most of the writing, and Hector would only write someplace that he could be 100% sure that only he and the Dollmaker would see it. Then again, it's just as likely that the Dollmaker, who's never been identified as a killer, and can just go back to his old life if he wants, is insistent about there being no record of his presence on the island. Given how much of the writing is about body management, which is the Dollmaker's specialty, I'm leaning towards him, but as far as I can tell, there's no way to be sure. So, that's the evidence. Kind of a relief to finally have this proven. Should I make a video about my terrible theory about who the Dollmaker is? Let me know! For now, I've been the Hidden Object Guru. Thanks for watching. If you had a good time and you'd like to see more, there's buttons coming up to help with that. Questions, comments, go down in the comments section below the video. Special thanks go out to Ferret for getting me the source file for the whiteboard, so I didn't have to have a terribly pixelated version of it for this video. We'll see you back here for more dark pictures, but until then I'll say that's right. Au revoir.